Good afternoon, everyone, here in the room and on Zoom, because we're live streaming this event. My name is Geneviève Zubrzitsky. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and I have the pleasure today to host Janine DiGiovanni, who is founder and director of the newly created NGO, the Reckoning Project, Ukraine Testifies. And she's also visiting fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She has held appointments at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs and also taught at Columbia University School of International and Public Administration. She has worked for over 35 years as a human rights reporter and investigator in conflict zones, covering the wars in the Balkans, Africa, and the Middle East. And she will tell us about her experience in those wars and what those wars can teach us about what's going on in Ukraine today. Her reporting has been published in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vanity Fair. She's a frequent analyst on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the BBC. DiGiovanni is also the best-selling author of 9 books. And her book, The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria, has been translated into 30 languages. The book is a collection of war testimonies. DiGiovanni is a recipient of nearly a dozen journalistic awards, including 2 Amnesty International awards, the National Magazine Award for her work in human rights and war reporting, and the Courage in Journalism Award for her distinguished work tracking war criminals, most recently in Syria and Iraq, with a focus on ISIS. She also, the list is long, and I'm only just giving you a glimpse of some of her achievements, but she also received a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Letters Blake Dodd Award, the highest distinction the Academy awards for a work of nonfiction, and that for her lifetime body of work. We're truly honored to have her with us today to discuss the challenges of human rights violations against civilian populations in conflict areas and address the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the important work that she's doing as co-founder and director of the Reckoning Project, a project at the University of Michigan and more specifically the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia is very proud to participate in. We're truly honored to have you here, Janine. It's great. I see a lot of students, faculty, members of the Ukrainian community and the broader Ann Arbor community, and also journalists and fellows from the Knight Wallace program, as well as our Scholars at Risk fellows from Ukraine. And so please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Janine DiGiovanni.
Thank you so much. Hi, it's so great to be here. Can you hear me? Is this working? Fine. It's my first time in Michigan, and I'm so thrilled to be at this beautiful and such an incredible university, and also the partnership with Geneviève. It's so thrilling, and I'm going to tell you more about that as we go on. But I think I'm going to start out by telling you about the work I do and why I do it. I just got off the phone with NPR, All Things Considered, and they want to do a segment on the Reckoning Project. And as I was talking to them, he said to me something like, the producer, how long have you been doing this? And I realized that it's more than half my life. That literally, really more than half my life was spent in war zones. And I thought, gosh, that's not normal, and it's sort of strange, but it's who I am. And part of the reason why I do what I do is because I left so many wars that were unfinished, and where justice was never delivered, and where justice was denied. And the bitterness I feel about that, and the sorrow, has really, really affected me. And so the Reckoning Project really came and was born out of that frustration. So I didn't want to be a war reporter. A lot of people, journalists, I know there's some journalists here, they probably all their lives wanted to be reporters. I didn't. I wanted to be a fiction writer. and I went to a place in the Middle West, the Iowa Writers Workshop for graduate school. And there I studied with some extraordinary people, and I thought I would live my life as an academic, and that I would teach at a university, and I would write novels, and I would have children, and a happy family life, and I'd have a really safe and beautiful life. And then something happened to me. Basically, I went to Israel during the first Intifada. I was not a political creature. I don't even think I read newspapers. I have to tell you the truth. I read novels. I lived in the world of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and French novelists, and I wasn't really involved with what was going on at that time in Latin America or the Middle East. But this first trip during the first Intifada, which means uprising in Arabic, stunned and shamed me that there were things going on in the world that I had no idea about. There I met an extraordinary woman who changed my life forever. And I think all of you, especially students and young people, I hope in your life you will meet someone like this who might not be your best friend, it might not even be your professor, it might be someone you have a chance encounter with, but someone who suddenly turns you towards a door that you weren't headed for. And that's what happened to me. She was called Felicia Langer. She was a survivor of the concentration camp. She was Polish, Jewish, and she was at that time the only Jewish lawyer working in Israel to defend Palestinians in military court. So she was a traitor, essentially. But she did it because she loved her country so much. She loved Israel. And she could not bear to see justice not being served there. So she took on this role. She went to law school very late in life, and it was a very unpopular role. She was hated. She was spat upon on the street. She had one child, like me, and her child was bullied at school because of his mother's work. Her office was firebombed, and she never won a case. I think she won 2 cases in a career that started in 1967 after the war and the occupation. But every day, she got up and she went to work. And she would go to court and she would cry. She was a very passionate woman. And I met her on my very first trip to Israel. And she said to me, if you have the ability to go to these places, then you have an obligation and a responsibility. I don't know why, but I took it to heart. And my life changed forever. This is personal, but I was married to a very nice man, and I was set to have that life I told you about. But that's not what happened. I went to Gaza, and then I kept going to Gaza, and then I kept going to the West Bank. And then after that, I kept going to Bosnia. And then I kept going to Africa. And then I kept going to Afghanistan and Iraq, and Syria, and now Ukraine. And my life turned out very differently from the one I imagined when I was a young woman. So why do I do it? I hate bullies. That's really a very boring answer, but it's true. I hate bullies. Whether it's someone bullying a kid in a playground. I went to a Catholic school, which was like rife with nasty, vicious bullying. Whether it was from the nuns or from the other kids. There was like a hierarchy of bullying. And in those days, in the 70s, you got away with it. And people were really cruel. And so I hated it then. I broke a kid's nose when I was 8 because he was ripping up my brother's homework, my older brother. And I took my backpack and swung it and bashed him across the head. He was like an 8th grader. I was in 3rd grade. The kid's mother called my mother and told him I was an animal. And my mother said she was defending her brother. So it's just bigger bullies now. But they're still bullies. Putin, Assad, Bashir, Kagame, Slobodan Milosevic. We could go down the list. They're the same people I saw on playgrounds beating up kids who were weaker or poorer or didn't have the advantages they had. So in my little way, and it's a small way, and the Reckoning Project is really small. I have to emphasize that. We're going to get tremendous help from Michigan, which I cannot tell you what it means to me to have my little team suddenly reinforced by social scientists like Yuri and Genevieve and Arina and Svetlana and the rest of you who are here who I might not have met, Kristen. It's like suddenly this little team of really bad football players is being reinforced by University of Michigan, a Big Ten team. So I'm really excited. So the Reckoning Project was born on February 25th, the day after the invasion. I had been teaching at Yale, teaching human rights, and I taught a course called Four Conflicts Through a Human Rights Lens. In the autumn, I taught Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, and Sierra Leone. And they were conflicts that were marked by humanitarian intervention that either happened, like Sierra Leone, where extraordinarily a brutal war was a 14-year war which was marked by some of the most gruesome crimes against humanity I've ever seen, and largely amputation of people so that they would serve as human symbols of fear. Or Bosnia, where intervention didn't happen until far too late, until a genocide occurred, Srebrenica. Or Kosovo, where 19 countries went to war for one small country because basically President Clinton felt guilty about Bosnia. So we would look at these conflicts in depth and examine the human rights. In the spring, I would teach a different section of war, which was Proxy Wars. So we looked at Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen. Some of them are wars that got a lot of attention, like Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of them, like Syria and Yemen, are pretty much ignored. In addition to being at Yale, I started a program at the United Nations called Enabling Witnesses, because I felt that in my many years as a war reporter, I had documented atrocities at a very high level. I'd been called to The Hague several times, but that it was almost like white man's savior, and I felt that people in their own countries should learn how to document atrocities. So I trained Yemeni, Syrian, and Iraqi journalists to do this, how to report war crimes. Some of them weren't journalists, actually. Some of them were doctors, some of them were first responders, some of them were civil society organizers, some of them were political activists. But I basically taught them how to report grievous crimes, sexual violence, torture, murder, extrajudicial killing. Terrible, dark things, but this is my world. And unfortunately it was COVID, so it was great, but it was COVID, so we had to do it remotely. Very, very hard for people in Yemen to have access to internet at all. Iraq, often people were trapped at checkpoints and couldn't get to meet us. So it wasn't as effective as I would have liked it, but it gave me an idea for something bigger, a way of training effectively people in the field to think like lawyers and to be trained like lawyers so that they could record evidence that would be admissible in court. So, February 25th, Peter Pomerantsev, who some of you might know is a British academic and an expert in propaganda, in particularly Russian disinformation. He was born in Kyiv. He worked for a long time in Moscow, in the media, so he knows inside and out the tricks of the Kremlin. He phoned me and said, what can we do? We've got to do something, and it's got to go deeper than journalism. It has to have impact. And I said, well, I just taught this course. Taught this course. I just ran this program for the UN in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. And he said, wait. And sometimes the stars align, and especially younger people, will learn this in life. Sometimes you have a great idea, and you really try to push it, and nothing happens. You might be trying to publish a novel or an article, or you might be trying to start an NGO, and it just doesn't work. In this case, everything worked, and within a week, we had funding from USAID. So, really extraordinary. But then I had to build a team, and then I had to make it happen. Suddenly I was given this responsibility to run a war crimes unit. So my first step was to hire an extraordinary Syrian called Raji Abdel Salam. Please don't tweet his name or write it publicly. He's very under the radar. He'd been a political activist in Syria. He then went on to become, I don't know what you would call him, a data processor, analyst, legal analyst. He basically looks at cases and incidents and then builds them into, we look for patterns and we build them into cases. He was basically my first hire. Then we began to hire our Ukrainian team. And we went through Natalia Gumanyuk, who you probably know is one of the best journalists in Ukraine. She hired 15 researchers, journalists. They had been investigative journalists, although I have a couple of human rights activists who weren't journalists. And by now we're 12, actually. 3 of the men were mobilized. We're mainly women working on the team because the men, of course, are all fighting. We then train them to a very high level. Raji and an international lawyer from London. We all gathered them in Kyiv because they came from all over Ukraine. Some of them from the occupied territories, some of them from Kherson, some of them from Kharkiv. And they were rigorously grilled into thinking like lawyers. To not ask questions like leading questions, to not interview traumatized victims, to work in a way with our methodology so that our statements and our testimonies would be admissible in court. 6 months on, we are beyond my wildest expectations. We have 82. Did I just say 82? 85. Last week it was, before I went to Berlin for a symposium, it was 75. So our testimonies, our incidents are growing and growing, which just shows you the level of the atrocities happening on the ground. We're now in a stage where we're building them into cases, working with Yuri, Kristen, Genevieve, Svetlana, a bunch of people, Arina. And we are going to feed them into computers and also go through them manually, looking for patterns, trying to establish chain of command, and then going after the bad guys. So it's a monumental task. And one of the questions that NPR just asked me was, is it really the role of a journalist to also be a human rights activist? And, aren't you supposed to be impartial? Aren't you supposed to be neutral? And I just said, well, first of all, I'm not a journalist anymore, really. I mean, I do write. I just had a piece in Vanity Fair, but I never was really a journalist. I was always a human rights defender from the moment I first went to the West Bank and Gaza and saw kids being shot, or saw people incarcerated that shouldn't have been incarcerated, or the siege of Sarajevo when innocent people lined up to get water or bread were bombed and killed, or saw snipers taking pot shots at children and hitting them in the knees just to cripple them. I don't think you can be objective in those kind of situations. I think you can be objective if you're a cultural reporter or you're writing for City Hall or something like that. But in my case, there were clearly defined lines of who were the perpetrators and who were the victims. And the victims were always the civilians. Now, is the Ukrainian army blameless? No. Do they also commit war crimes? Absolutely. Do they sometimes put civilians in harm's way by parking their military equipment close to civilian areas? Yes. But in this case, as in Syria, there is one side which is absolutely doing much, much more, and that is Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin and his killing machine. I've been in 3 Putin wars. It's hard for me to believe it. Grozny, the fall of Grozny in January 2000, when I really thought, that was the moment. And people often say to me, when did you think you were going to die? And I said, Grozny. Because I really thought, that's it. My 9 lives are over. It was the most relentless aerial bombardment on civilians that someone said to me, before I went, before you decide 2 weeks before the bombing drives you to the point of madness, begin to try to find your way out of Grozny, because it will take you 2 weeks to get out. Because, of course, Grozny, Chechnya was closed off. You couldn't just wander into Chechnya the way you can go to Ukraine. I mean, anyone could go to Ukraine. Now you get on a train from Poland. Then it was completely closed off. Only Russian journalists who were accredited with visas could go from Moscow. So those of us that wanted to cover the Chechen side had to go illegally and cross over the mountains of Georgia, or in my case, walk from Ingushetia. So I was there illegally. I was one of the few foreigners there. There was no UN. There was no Doctors Without Borders. There were no journalists, because no one could get in. It was me, a German journalist, and a French journalist, and that was it. But we recorded and documented the fall of Grozny, and we called it, basically, Grozny has fallen to Russian forces. Putin turned Grozny into a parking lot, into an undistinguishable pile of rubble. Long after the people were dead, long after people fled, when the only people left there were the people who couldn't afford to run away, or were poor, were sick, or old. And yet he kept on bombing and bombing and bombing and bombing. And aerial bombardment is really scary. I hope that in your life you will never witness it. It's terrifying. And these people endured it and suffered tremendously. Aleppo. What can I say about Syria? We failed Syria. We, the international community. There's still a war going on in Syria, but no one cares, no one writes about it, because the bad guy won. Assad won, aided by Vladimir Putin, who went to war in 2015 with his warplanes and leveled East Aleppo. So the day Aleppo fell, December 16th, 2016, I cried and cried and felt like I have failed in my job. We tried so hard to affect policy. Part of a journalist's role is to affect policy. And we did that in Bosnia. We really did. Bosnia was one place where journalists could say to President Clinton, you flip-flopped on policy, which Christiane Amanpour did. It was a place where journalists were documenting the darkest corner of the world and bringing it to light. We didn't prevent a genocide at Srebrenica where 8,000 Muslim men and boys died, but we did a lot. I didn't feel that way with Rwanda, where 1 million people died. 1 million people died in 3 months. 1 million people. Think about that. No one cared because they were people of color. Now we look at it, of course, and we see our failures and our mistakes. But then, in 1994, the summer of 1994, it was agonizing to witness. So I feel, if I look back on my very long career, I see failures and I see triumphs. But the greatest triumphs were the ones where I really felt that we served. You know, that as I think I'm a public servant, I see myself as a public servant, that my role is to work for the public. And what we're trying to do now in Ukraine is not let the bad guys get away with it. Because if they do, that sends a message to every single bad guy out there. And there's a lot of them in places, you don't even think about. Azerbaijan, the narcos in Mexico, Bashar al-Assad, where there's still a war, Yemen, Saudi, Egypt, China, lots of terrible things happening, the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas. So if we do not go after Putin and his men, and women, and the people responsible for this, we're basically saying it's okay. Because that's what impunity is. It's basically saying, you can kill people, you can torture people, you can go to Bucha and shove skewers of metal through people's noses so it comes out the other side. You can rape and you can torture and you can detain people in prison for no reason at all for years and years and years on end. And you can get away with it. You can walk away. And you could go to a yacht in the south of France, or you could go to your mountain home in Germany. So that's why the Reckoning Project, as teeny as we are, we've got a real mission. And our mission is to go after these guys. We're documenting, we're verifying, we're archiving, and we're saying, one day, we're going to get you. So that is my story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to answer questions. I know there's people on Zoom. I'm very happy to go more in depth if there's a certain conflict you want me to talk about. Most likely I've been there or reported. Sadly, not Latin America and very little in Asia. Just, you can't be everywhere and you have to know your expertise. And my expertise is the Middle East, the Balkans, and Africa, and now Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janine. So we're going to take questions from the audience. We have about, 45 minutes.
Sure.
So I will let you take questions from the audience unless you want me to take a cue. And I will go to Zoom once in a while.
Okay. And again, I'm happy to, if there's something, no question is too small or too banal, I'm very happy to go into detail about things.
Raise your hand, not to you, but to people with microphones so that they can see you. And if you can say very briefly, stand up, say your name so that Janine knows.
Yeah, hi. Hi. Thank you for coming for the lecture. I really got like goosebumps on my skin when you were talking so passionately about justice. And my question today, I'm an economist, and today I'm a PhD student, and I had a meeting with one of the professors. And he asked me about Ukraine. I said, there is this horrible situation. I don't feel good. And anyway, he spent 15 minutes telling me that I don't have to have my hopes up because he doesn't believe that justice will be served. And I really respect him, and I think he is, he has his opinion, and it matters. And he would talk to his friends. And what do you think? Like, is it common right now among the people who are more entitled, I would say, to have this opinion? Because when I've heard that, look, you have to prepare that South and East will be occupied too and nobody going to do anything. And this is a person who, has high ethics, and I really, really respect him.
Where is he from?
It doesn't matter. He's American. But that's the thing, that he was really confident that Ukraine already won enough. And you have to be satisfied.
Right.
And, in 10 years, forget, nobody will care.
Right.
That's the thing. How do you think, how is it common opinion among that those people who are elite, I would say, and how it can be changed? Maybe, of course, through journalists, but they all read New York Times, Vanity Fair. I am sure that they know the evidence and they read it. How to read them out?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, so there's two levels of this. The first is that, and I'll give an example. Right after Bucha, so April, I was called by the Deputy Secretary General of the UN to moderate a weekend retreat for extremely high-level UN women officials. This is off the record, by the way. Please, no tweeting. This is a little bit of Chatham House rules here. Publicly. All right. Well, how do I say this? I don't think amongst the global South and Africa there is the same view of solidarity that Britain, the U.S., France, Germany, basically the NATO countries have in supporting Ukraine. They feel, I think, that, and I've heard people say this, actually human rights researchers, that Ukrainians are spoiled because there is so much attention going to them. There's no attention going to Yemen, and there's terrible things going on in Yemen. I think that it's far more complicated than that, and that brings it to the level of a Cold War. These are, if we let Putin erase borders, right, and let him erase the border between Russia and Ukraine, then what's going to stop him from going to Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and who's going to fight for those countries? No one. So people do say, and it's usually it's the same people who defended Bashar al-Assad. It's really strange. It's like an extreme left wing. We call them the red-brown coalition, the red-brown fascists, because they defend, it's anything anti-American essentially is good. And that means defending people like Bashar al-Assad or Vladimir Putin. There's plenty of people on Twitter. There's plenty of bloggers. I'm sure you know them. They're, Max Blumenthal, Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett. There are these people. They're usually funded by Russia Today. And they are out to basically change the narrative. It's not my role to convince them, nor is it I'm not a diplomat, so Zelensky is doing his work in Africa and places where he needs to gather more support. My job is to gather evidence and to say to people who deny that this stuff is happening, here it is. How are you going to deny this? This happened. We have the evidence, we have the empirical evidence, and we have verified it. So in places like Srebrenica now, where history has been rewritten, Genevieve is an expert on memorials, right? We have to somehow stop history being rewritten by disinformation. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, right? If Venezuela or Cuba, I don't know. I don't even know if those are the countries that dispute Ukraine's right to have aid from the West, the so-called West, or it being a NATO war. I see it as something different. I see it as the Ukrainians fighting for us, for democracy, because Putin's main objective is disruption. It's not about greater Russia or Russia world. It's not. It's about dividing Europe by inflaming extreme far-right politicians and anti-immigrant rhetoric, and then flooding Europe with immigrants, so that it will cause dissension. He thrives on disruption, and that's what he's trying to do. So really interesting China abstained from the vote today, or yesterday, because maybe his allies aren't as strong as we think they are. And I think clearly this morning that the mobilization of 300,000 and his ridiculous threats about nuclear, the wind turning, to me it's a sign of weakness. It's showing how scared he is. And check the planes in Russia today of how many people are men, of course, who are being mobilized, are fleeing as fast as they can. So, people can say what they want, but what we are doing is hard evidence. And that's all. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Elena. I'm a human rights lawyer. I have two questions. I deeply appreciate what you are doing, and this is very important. My first question is, what particular accountability mechanisms you are going to use in order to hold the perpetrators accountable? The second question I have, it's probably not only to you, but that there are parallel projects, including local projects, who are also trying to find evidence and to document, and this is probably would be the first very well documented war which we have ever had, which I deeply appreciate. My question in all these cases is always how it is possible to attribute the responsibility to particular individuals. I'm not meaning Putin, I'm not meaning the Kremlin and the staff, I'm not meaning the generals, I mean ordinary soldiers.
The low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, criminal responsibility should be individualized.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so first, what mechanisms are we using? By the way, could I sit? Is it possible to get a chair so I could sit down? Is that, yeah. Sorry, I just came from Berlin from a conference with all the civil society accountability space in Ukraine. Thanks. Perfect. Sorry, but I'm just jet lagged, so I don't know if I could stand for 45 minutes. So first and foremost, we're working with the Ukrainian national courts because I think, they have a good judicial system. And we're working with them. We're working with the UN Commission on Inquiry. We're working universal jurisdiction, mainly because Raji, my colleague, had tried, helped to build the case at Koblenz, which was the first Syrian war crimes case. The ICC traditionally does not like to work with civil society organizations at all. They like to send their own investigators, but there are so many crimes in Ukraine right now, and the ICC sent like 6 people in May, So we're Ukrainian. We're there. We're on the ground. My people come from Kherson and from Kharkiv and from Sumy. They're from there. They're local. So they have much greater access, and they're able to go back over and over with the witnesses to get correct statements. Your second question was about right. Well, that's one of the things we were just discussing in our meeting earlier with Michigan, with legal experts. It's establishing the chain of command, and of course you probably know the first 2 trials were of very low-ranking soldiers, but nonetheless soldiers who killed civilians. I think it's really important to get the people definitely to get like the butcher of Aleppo and Mariupol, who's the same guy, and to get high-ranking members of the Kremlin, and to get the disinformation specialists who are working to lie to the Russian people. I think they should all be held accountable. But I also think that the people that commit the crimes, like the Buryats who were in Bucha, who did horrific, horrific things, have to be called out as well. The ICC is working kind of at that level. In Bosnia, one of the terrible things, and I failed to mention this, Bosnia is in a very precarious, very dangerous state right now. I think it easily could slip into war again, and part of the reason is that justice was never delivered. There was the ICTY, they did try, they really did try, but very few indictments. They got Milosevic, but Milosevic died before justice was reached. But worse was the rape. There was systematic rape in Rwanda and Bosnia. 20,000 women were raped, and estimated, probably more. 20,000. In rape camps where they were held to be impregnated to break the gene pool, to break the Muslim gene pool, so that a Serb would rape them and they wouldn't have a Muslim baby, they'd have a mixed baby. And I met many of these women and their children who were born from rape. 26 people were indicted for that. And I know women that had to go back to their village and face their rapists every single day. And one of them said to me, when I pass them in the street, it's me who has to drop my eyes in shame, not them. They mock me. So I think that's the best answer I can give. It's really important to get the people who committed the crimes as well. What we're doing, we're small. We're gathering, for instance, when I go to Bucha or Kharkiv or Chernihiv, and we try to work on, very specific things, the bombing of an apartment building, we try to get as much detail as we can about the units, about who were in the units. Then forensic people come in, satellite imagery, people with far more expertise at, I think, these sort of, what would these skills, forensic skills. We're doing human testimonies, human witnesses.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee to our Zoom. So thank you very much for your talk. I'm really interested in the methodology you spoke about earlier. You mentioned to train people to think like lawyers and to record war crimes. What exactly is this methodology? How is it different from other kinds of journalism? Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, well, we're not journalists anymore. So a journalist would go, if I was reporting the war in Ukraine, I would go, and while I was never the kind of television journalist that shoves a microphone in someone's face and says, how do you feel? And believe me, journalists do this kind of stuff. I was always really sensitive. I always, was very aware if people were traumatized. But you absolutely, in the work that we're doing now, you cannot interview traumatized people. You can't take statements from traumatized people, because traumatized people, their memories and their recollections are distorted. One of the, we've all been trained in trauma, not only to protect ourselves, but for our, not to re-traumatize people. So you cannot take someone that's just witnessed the bombing of a train station where many people were killed and saw mutilated bodies and try to get them to recollect. You have to kind of wait until they're in a safe space. So that's one big difference. The other is you can't use leading questions. So if I was a journalist in my former life and I was working in Bucha, I might say to a witness that was telling me her story, and when the Buryat came, what did they do? Well, by already saying Buryat, I'm leading her, right? So instead we would say something like, what happened? What happened to you? We take metadata, so we have very specific, details of when, where, who they are, and very kind of detailed recollections of what happened. Raji uses something he calls the 3 Cs. I don't honestly know if he made this up himself or if this is an actual methodology, but he uses, it's called correct, concrete, and coherent. So that's basically our methodology. We have a template, we have a questionnaire, and they follow it very, very carefully, our researchers. Then they submit to me and Raji their statements, which are in Ukrainian. Svetlana is going to lead a team who are actually going to translate them, because at the moment we struggle to read them in the English that they're translated into. And then we look for patterns, and then we build cases. So I hope that answered anonymous caller on Zoom.
Hello, my name is Masrat, and I'm a Knight Wallace Fellow. I'm a journalist. I want to know, there are a number of wars going on in the world, and why there is less media attention on some of the wars, and why, other wars, they are giving the high media attention. I'm from a conflict zone. I'm from Kashmir.
Yeah.
And when people ask me, where are you from? I say I'm from Kashmir, and they give me the very cold reaction. What? Where is Kashmir? Because Kashmir is a conflict zone, and there is this war crimes and human rights violation going on from last 3 decades. And people don't know where is Kashmir. I just want to know about this. What's your opinion?
I completely feel what you are saying, because I spent years campaigning for Africa to be more in the news. Wars in Congo, Burundi, Somalia, Zimbabwe. Luckily, I worked for a British newspaper which was very supportive of African stories, and I lived in Africa for many years. But Yemen, or just, Afghanistan. Who cares about Afghanistan now? It is so tragic about how Afghanistan was abandoned. Iraq. And those are countries that were much better covered. I honestly can say to you, one thing I think is that most people, not people in this room, because clearly all of you are here because you have an interest in international politics or justice or a greater issue. Most people don't care and don't want to know. There's something called compassion fatigue, which is actually a psychological condition, where, and a colleague of mine, a British colleague, way back during the Rwandan genocide, wrote a paper called Compassion Fatigue about actually the number of minutes it takes for you to watch a television screen of an incident before your mind literally shuts off because you can't take it. Last night I was watching Senator John Ossoff from Georgia, who released a report about the death of people in American prisons, incarcerated. And I started thinking about the American judicial system and how I hate it, and how, so much about it pains me. And I hope someday, when the Reckoning Project is off the ground, we could take it to the U.S. and work on people who are falsely imprisoned or people imprisoned for nonviolent crimes. Anyway, my point is, while I watched this, I started to cry because there was a mother on it talking about her son who was in prison for a nonviolent crime, who was calling her, begging her to get him out because he needed medical help and he wasn't getting medical assistance, and he died in prison. And they were showing the trial and the mother sobbing. And even me, with my exposure to what I've been exposed to, I couldn't bear it. I could not bear it. I had to turn off CNN. So I think most people, Kashmir, I know quite a bit about that because I've had students from Kashmir who wrote long case studies for me about the human rights violations, the disappearances, the torture. I think there's certain parts of the world people focus on. And again, we could get back to your question about why Ukraine and why not Kashmir? Why not Yemen? It's not fair, and there is no justice to it. And once in a while, you get a really good editor that insists on, and I'm very lucky that I worked in the golden age of journalism in the 1990s when foreign correspondents could go. I could say, I want to go to Kashmir and see what's going on. And they'd say, what side do you want to go to, India or Pakistan? Go. And they'd give me a satellite phone and some money, and I'd go off and stay for months. But that's not what journalism is like now. You know that. Journalism is Twitter. Even my students at Yale got their news from Twitter or Facebook. They didn't read the New York Times or the Atlantic or the New Yorker or Vanity Fair. They wanted to use clickbait. So all I can say to you, as a journalist from Kashmir, you have to shout it from the rooftops. That's your mission. Mine right now is Ukraine. I can't do everything and I can't be everywhere. And also, I think it's very important to have expertise. So I think it's really important to either focus on Africa or Balkans or Ukraine or Kashmir and make it your story and your passion and your expertise. And really drive it in there, you know? And only you could do that.
I have another one from Zoom. What would you say to Russians who do not support the government's actions in Ukraine? What can they do to support Ukraine, whether they are living abroad or currently in Russia? And you just mentioned that several, thousands of men are getting on planes now to escape mobilization, conscription. And there's a lot of academics also and journalists who had to leave Russia to save their lives. So, any words?
So, as you probably know, and I know there's a Russian journalist here from, you, right? Are you the Russian? No. Anyway, a lot of people in exile are in Latvia right now, trying to kind of lead an anti-Putin tribunal of sorts, or to try to overthrow him is too big a word, but I think to lead the kind of cause against Putin. There are plenty of people in Russia who are really suffering right now because of the news blackout, but there's also plenty of people, and when I was in Chernihiv, which is very close to the Russian border, people were telling me their relatives who are Ukrainians, who are living in places like right over the Russian border, would call them and say, what is this fairy tale about Ukraine at war? You're not at war. And the people in Chernihiv would say, we just have been bombed. We've been living in cellars for 2 months. And the relatives would say, oh, no, you're being brainwashed by the media. And Zelensky's a Nazi and a fascist. And so I think there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Russia who don't want to live like this. And, you were telling me earlier you were born in 1995 in a different Russia. And I remember, first going to Russia right after the wall came down, and it was like alive in a way that it wasn't democratic, but it was going a way where people felt that they could be free. And now it is significantly undemocratic. So to live like that is exceptionally painful. What can we do to help them, to support them? That is a question not for me in my wheelhouse. That's for the disinformation specialists like my colleague Peter Pomerantsev. who are working on all kinds of initiatives to get information into Russia where it's blocked.
My name is Tim. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences with us. My question was, in the cases specifically of Syria and Ukraine, I know Russia has relied a lot on private military companies.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm wondering what additional obstacles to accountability there are with these groups where they're already shrouded in so much secrecy and there's just an inherent layer of plausible deniability.
Yeah, the Wagner Group. They're mainly operating in Africa, though. I mean, I think they are in Ukraine. I'm not an expert on them. I'm not really following the militias. But I do know from working in Africa where private militias like Executive Outcome, Aegis, people like that were really operating with impunity. They are subject to accountability the same way as everyone else. Even I think what we think of them morally, paid soldiers, mercenaries. There was a time in Africa whenever and I'm not laying blame on South Africa, but wherever I heard a South African accent and it was like a pilot who had come from the Rhodesian War, I knew that there was something bad about to happen. It was in the Ivory Coast in 2000, I can't even remember. It was the most peaceful country in West Africa, surrounded by, terrible wars, Liberia, and Liberia and Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast was safe. And I remember going to a hotel to swim in a pool, and I heard these South African guys talking about planes, and I went up to them and I said, "Oh, wow, why are you guys here?" And they said, "Get the fuck out of here." And I thought, shit. And you know what? The next week, a war broke out in the Ivory Coast. I'm not saying they were responsible for it, but they backed it up the same way they backed up Sierra Leone. So the Wagner Group and the man who runs the Wagner Group, they are all, of course, on the hit list. And they are on the hit list, meaning the accountability list, not the execution list. But they will be held in the same way that everyone else is. And it's a terrible job to be a paid soldier, to fight in a war. I mean, one of the reasons the Ukrainians are winning is because they're fighting for their country, right? And one of the reasons the Russians are losing, because those Russian kids that were sent to Ukraine, not even knowing where they were going, don't know why they're fighting. It's like Americans in Vietnam. They were sent to a war that was far away that they had no idea what they were fighting for. So I never understood the logic of mercenaries, and to be honest with you, I've always stayed really far away from them because they scare me, and I think they're really dangerous people. Not the direct answer you want, but the best I could do with it.
Yes, my.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
Oh, I can go.
Let's take that question and then.
Dear Janine, first I wanted to thank you for being here and for your very difficult work that you are doing, because for your strength, because it's not only strength to work with people that you're working with, but doing it when, at least from time to time, you probably feel that the world is looking away from it. I have a question. I'm a statistician here at the University of Michigan, and you mentioned that now the Reckoning project will have a quantitative part. And I'm interested to see how historically the patterns and statistical evidence was used in the courts. If you can talk about it.
I think Kristen should answer that one. I'm not a social scientist. I'm a human rights investigator, and I'm the director of the project. So what I'm good at is building a team of people who know things that I don't know. So Genevieve or Kristen could take over, or Yuri could speak on that.
Yeah, maybe Yuri, but basically we're starting with the evidence that they are gathering. And based on these testimonies, these written testimonies, that we're deconstructing in a way to get the information that's relevant. And then from there, then we're going to have a database with Yuri Zhukov also, who will work in work his magic. He's a political scientist, so he's going to be working on that and run statistical equation software. We talked about different ways of doing it, and mapping also with spatial
mapping and satellite imagery.
Satellite imagery, and then once those patterns. So I think that the first step is collecting the data, right? That the testimonies, the first-hand accounts, and then to prepare them in a way that lawyers can then do something, build the cases, and in the middle, we're here and trying to establish patterns, because I think this is something that's very important, is that not just individual cases, but establish if there are really commonalities across cases, across regions, etc., to make very strong legal cases.
So until now, I had been going through, Raji and myself, were like going through line by line by line of really dense reports, and I'd be looking up at the same time whether or not, which Geneva Convention this violated, which international humanitarian law it violated, were they minors, were military facilities nearby, and now we're going to have Yuri and Genevieve and Kristen. So we've got social scientists, political scientists, sociologists. Yuri, do you want to say just a few words about how you're going to contribute to it?
Sure, and I think Genevieve conveyed the gist of the project very well. Ultimately, what we're looking for is patterns. We want to distinguish patterns of behavior from one-off random events, build a case, and that is one way in which statistical tools can be quite helpful in seeing whether something happens more regularly than we expected by chance. We do this by looking at the testimonies of the individuals, so we do this by looking at the locations where the reports originate, the timing, and then we link those records to other types of data about unit locations, about military operations, about territorial control, both to verify these accounts as well as to provide some context and to see how they relate to the overall picture. So I'm happy to provide more details offline, but that's the gist of it.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So we've kind of gone from being, as I said, like a little, we're expanding into a much larger frame.
We have another question here. Yes. My name is Anna Zakieva. I'm from Kazakhstan. My question relates to the issue, so-called Uyghur issue in Xinjiang, China. What is your evaluation of this issue? What there will be short-term or long-term consequences of so-called re-education campaign? So will be the end of this violation of human rights according to the Western experts?
Thank you. Like Kashmir, the situation of the Uyghurs makes me deeply ashamed. There's so little reporting from it because no one could get there, right? I mean, very hard. People like me could never get visas to go to China, and if we did, we'd be followed everywhere. I mean, I'm not allowed to go to these places. I can't go to Iran. I can't go to Russia. I'm PNG'd from Russia. So we know very little. But there's also a very powerful Chinese lobby that won't let us have demonstrations at universities, pro-Uyghur rallies, or Uyghur activists. So it's a really painful topic. And I think the little we know of what is going on, I had a Uyghur activist friend. She'd gone to Harvard Law School. She was at Yale. She tried to raise awareness constantly and was always met with a brick wall. It's really shameful, and it's something I wish I could work more on. Maybe, again, my focus is completely on Ukraine right now, and then I would love to take the Reckoning Project to other parts of the world, like the Rohingyas, like the Uyghurs, like Yemen, like parts of Africa that are being ignored. So I'm sorry, that's all I can really say about it.
I have a question, because you were talking about the different wars that you covered, and that you have experience of some of Putin's wars. So what are the patterns that you you talked about how they tend to level
Yeah.
cities, but can you tell us more about?
Yeah, I was talking to a Ukrainian soldier who said it like very simply, like they love to shell. They just absolutely, like, long after the building is rubble, they keep shelling. That, and from villages that I was in Chechnya, like Shamaski, where the soldiers went absolutely crazy, and Yuri was earlier talking about, political violence from the angle of a political scientist and why soldiers do this. But in Bucha, I thought I'd seen everything in my life. I've spent years, interviewing victims of extreme torture. Unbelievable that they're still alive. A guy in Syria who was operated on whilst he was awake without anesthesia by a doctor who took a Hippocratic oath to torture him. And he was tossed into a pile of corpses in a morgue because they thought he was dead. And somehow this guy survived. It was such a severe form of torture that I thought, he must be exaggerating. But I literally got his medical records and had, everything verified. And so what I saw in Bucha was equivalent. And I think there is this pattern of indiscriminate attacks on civilians as a way of weakening the society, as a way of weakening the morale. I mean, we saw what happened in Mariupol, right? Like, it just wasn't enough to, hit columns of people in these so-called green corridors. It's not enough to, I have testimony after testimony of people who were in cars trying to flee with their kids, trying to get out of the cities that were being bombed. All they were doing was trying to run away. And they were attacked with signs in the windows saying children. So there is this kind of pattern that we're seeing a lot of indiscriminate attacks on civilians over and over. And civilians are always my main focus. They're to me the people that need the protection and need the accountability the most.
Thank you so much, Janine. My name is Anna Taranenko. I'm from Ukraine. I'm a part of Ukrainian scholar group here. And thank you very much again. And I have sort of two questions. I'm interested in fighting, research and disinformation. And so my question is, again, in your career, what are your observations? Are there any differences or trends in disinformation, like narratives, or maybe some mechanisms, like how they changed over time this past decades, and maybe some ideas on the counter narratives, how to fight those disinformation pitches, so to speak. And my second question is about, I read yesterday that there's information that up to 90% of those soldiers, Russian soldiers who committed crimes, that military group in Bucha, they might be dead by now
because of Chernobyl. Because they went to Chernobyl after and went to the Red Forest.
Yeah, and also it's part of the strategy of Russian leadership is to send them to fight again, so they die. And basically, there is no way, how in this case justice is restored.
They're dead.
Yeah. If the perpetrator is dead. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's start with disinformation. And again, my colleague Peter Pomerantsev is the expert on disinformation, but I'll tell you a story from Syria, which involves Russia. So there was a group of humanitarians called the White Helmets. Does anyone know who they are or heard about them? The White Helmets were these really extraordinary guys. They realized very early on in Aleppo that no one cared about them and no one was coming to save Syria. So they were like vegetable sellers, there was a couple teachers, they were like local guys, and they got together and they started to dig people out of the rubble. Because what happens when you're bombed, and the Russians were bombing heavily, again, back to your question, heavily civilian areas, residential areas, hospitals and schools. That's the other big Putin thing. Bomb hospitals, kill doctors, because if you kill one doctor, you kill 100 people. So the White Helmets would go in, and at first they literally were digging out with their hands. They rescued babies, they rescued people, they dug them out. Then they got more popular, and they got a grant from, it was led by a British guy called James Le Mesurier, a friend of mine, And he got the money, he began to train them, they would train as firefighters, they got more sophisticated, they got cranes, they got tools. And then the Russian trolls came in, and they were led by this group of ghouls that I mentioned earlier, Max Blumenthal, Vanessa Bili, and Eva Bartlett, all who work for RT, Russia Today, in some way. And these guys started a narrative that the White Helmets were Al-Qaeda. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And it grew to the point, and there was, by the way, there was a bad apple who was holding a black flag, and that guy was dismissed immediately. But the majority of the White Helmets, nearly all of them, and I knew them, I worked with them, were simply Syrian civilians who were helping other civilians because no one else helped them, and it was a community service that was extraordinary. They were heroes. They were really, I have to say, I thought superheroes really do exist. And their whole logic was that if you're from our neighborhood and you get bombed, you're going to know that one of us is going to come and get you. Because, when you get bombed and you're lying under rubble, you don't die right away. It's really horrible. Your legs are broken, your lungs are crushed, you've got serious head injuries, but you usually don't die right away. You can be there for 2 or 3 days under rubble. And their logic was, we're coming for you. We're going to help you. We're going to get you out. The Russians started doing this really inhumane thing called the double tap, which was there'd be a bomb, the White Helmets would go in, and while they were digging people out, the Russians would hit them again and kill the White Helmets. So there was something at one point where it was 70% of them knew they would die when they would go in to help people. Disinformation. By, I'd say, 2016, 17, Russia came into the war in 2015. The narrative that the White Helmets were bad guys was so pronounced that I had serious academics, intelligent people who read papers coming up to me saying, but the White Helmets are Al-Qaeda, aren't they? It was so effective, their campaign. James Lemasurier killed himself in Turkey. The White Helmets are still operating, but they were severely damaged. So that's the story for you of disinformation. How to counter it? There are experts working on it. I'm not one of them. Again, I do my little role. But Latvia, Riga, as you probably know, is the center of it. Bellingcat, people like that, working seriously to kind of counter it with evidence. Because if you present them with evidence, how do you dispute that? But they still do. Eva Bartlett just got back from Donbass, and she's saying basically that, there's no Russian war crimes, it's all Ukrainian war crimes. I hope that helped.
Dear Janine, thank you very much for your lecture and your work. My name is Yuri Kaparulin. I'm fellow at Advisor Center, and also I'm a straight professor at Kherson State University in Ukraine, in a university which now evacuated to Western Ukraine because Kherson is under temporary Russian occupation. Yeah, I'm a historian, and I work in the field of Holocaust study and also genocide studies. And a couple of years ago, I just think about should I only study this topic in historical context because what's happening in my country, in Ukraine, from 2014. I tried to think about what I can do for fight with crimes against humanity, what Russia commit in Ukraine. And this because I'm started study law, and do my work interdisciplinary. So my question for you, sometimes for better understanding some huge crimes, especially crime of genocide, we need to look in wide picture of events, not only on crimes of committing last week, month, or last year. For example, under Nazi regime, because Holocaust started not from mass murder in 1941, but from discriminations in 1933. In case of Ukraine, what do you think should be added to evidence, some historical context for understanding this war more deeply, because what happened in Ukraine in 2022 maybe it's only final stage of long-term Putin's plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more tomorrow. We have a meeting, and I really want to talk to you more. So what I'm really struck by in Ukraine, and I'm not a historian, is the level of trauma, going back to the Holodomor, of which until I started reading Ukraine history maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I didn't know about, because we're not taught that in American schools, unless you're studying very specifically Central Europe. I feel like as a historian, you have to explain what led to this, like why. I still can't understand, in a sense, like especially the language and the Russification, like the desire to wipe out Ukraine to such an extent, which I've really only seen before in Rwanda, the Hutus wiping out the Tutsis, the Yazidis, like this, or the Kurds. You know, the language issue I think is really important, and it's interesting that like many of my researchers, we have someone in Herzog, by the way, they grew up speaking Russian, and they spoke Russian at home, but they're now only speaking Ukrainian. And, you know, this whole process we have cases of children, many children, unfortunately, being taken across the border, and while their parents are still alive, mainly kids from Mariupol, and put into Russian adoption centers to, like, Russify them. And I find this chilling. And I think it's not my job, it is your job, to try to get to, and to make clear to people as well, not just other historians, not just Timothy Snyder, but, you know, or Anne Applebaum, but, you know, people like us, like to understand why such hatred. And I wrote an article about Ukraine, and I used the line by T.S. Eliot from a poem, "After such knowledge, what forgiveness?" I would have thought it would have been that after the Holodomor, you know, where millions and millions of people were starved to death. Like, the brutality of that is beyond comprehension. And now this. I think the more important question for me, and I think there was someone here who's transitional justice expert, but how long will it take, and how will you recover, and what kind of country will Ukraine be after this war ends, having gone through so much? And last week we had a big conference in Berlin with many of the civil society groups in Ukraine working on what we're doing, and some of them were able to come, like Two Towns and Zanina and Alexandra Makashuk and many others. And I said to them, I asked them, I said, like, what is your country, can you envision what your country is going to look like when this war ends? Like, how will reconciliation ever happen? It's just way too early to think of. But they couldn't answer me, you know, they just couldn't think about it, because it's just the trauma, the pain is just so deep, and it's so historically, it's all hinged on history. I hope you read that answered, and I hope to talk to you more about it tomorrow.
We have one question from Zoom from Alexandra Chalti. Could a global scrutiny of Russia's tactics in Ukraine lead to a resolution of the Syrian civil war? With millions of Syrian refugees unable to return and no war crimes punished, the war there is by no means over, but seems to be forgotten, as you pointed out. There is finally global coverage of the connection between Putin's war.
Yeah, this is my project, specifically at the Reckoning Project. What I'm doing is linking Syria to Ukraine. Alexandra, I have pointed out many times on Twitter, on wherever I can, there is still a war going on in Syria. But, there's nothing about it in the press. It's almost as though people are ashamed that, this war has been going on. What are we now, 2022? Since 2011? That's a lifetime for a kid. Refugees, 7 million people outside the country who cannot go home because it's not safe to go home. I don't think they'll ever go home. And then the displaced, the destruction, the people who are rotting in Assad's prisons. So will there be accountability? Yes. I specifically have 2 Syrians on my team. And I have them on my team because they are Syrian. And they understand very well what Ukraine is going through. And one of them is a Syrian lawyer. And one of my researchers, from Herzog actually, asked him a question. She said, these are my people. How do I take testimonies when they're crying and I have to think like a lawyer and not be emotional? And he said to her, I'm Syrian. I know what you're going through. I had to work in Syria. I had to take testimony of torture, of rape, of murder. So I'm with you. And I think in a way, unless you have gone through that yourself, there's no way. I work in Ukraine. I've worked in 18 wars. As I said, I spent more than half my life in wartime. But I am not Ukrainian. But I think no one can understand it as closely as someone else who has gone through it in Syria. So yes, I do hope that by shedding this light on Ukraine, we will go back to Syria.
We have time for one last question.
Hello, my name is Marat. Amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. Hold it closer. Got it. So in regard to you talking about how if we don't hold people accountable now, we won't hold bad people accountable in the future. I think if we look right now at Azerbaijan and Armenia or Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, bad people are already getting away with it, especially in regards to Armenia when Russia was supposed to be Armenia's protector. How do you think that squares with both the short-term narrative and the long-term narrative of Russia's intervention in the areas around it, and what do you think the consequences might be?
Well, it's a really good question because it's what I said earlier. If we allow him to erase a border, which is essentially what he did, he just kind of this is mine. What will stop him from erasing borders in the Baltic states that no one will care about, or Armenia or Georgia, which is still not resolved, or other countries, or starting in Africa? Putin's all over Africa. The Wagner Group, as someone pointed out earlier, he's all over Africa. So I think that the message is just really clear. He has to be held accountable. And if not now, then when? How long do we deny justice to people? And I go back again to Bosnia. And I always go back to Bosnia because Bosnia was really my first war and my first heartbreak, because I saw immense suffering and people never even got the, any kind of inkling of justice. Srebrenica, I had mothers tell me about, they dressed their sons, their teenage sons, like girls so that they wouldn't be, they separated the men from the women under the eyes of the UN, who allowed it to happen. And there were mothers whose sons were ripped from their arms, and they never saw them again. I know daughters who told me the last thing they saw was their father's jean jacket as he disappeared into the forest, and she didn't see her father again until a video 10 years later was shown on Bosnian television of a mass grave being exhumed and her father being murdered. It had been filmed. So when I think of those people who never got justice, and that there are still people that say, Srebrenica wasn't a genocide and 8,000 men weren't killed, I just think of how much more urgent it is for us to keep working on Ukraine. And yes, the Uyghurs and many other places, Syria, deserve exactly the same kind of justice. But little by little. And I do think by going after Putin and his men, it shows the bad guys everywhere, that you can't get away with it. We're going to get you, and we're going to get you one day. And we will. We'll be ready. We'll have the cases ready. Before we close, I just want to ask one thing. Please, can you follow us on Twitter or Instagram? It's @TRP Ukraine. We're just starting our little social media, and I've got a really great team of interns keeping it going. And I'm @JanineDG, so you can also read about the Reckoning Project through us.
Janine, thank you so much for being
great.
here
Thank you,
today.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you do, for being here, and for including us in this very important endeavor.
Great audience. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for coming, and thank you for supporting us. And stay tuned. I think I'll be coming back and forth to Michigan a lot. And
thank you.